If you want demons to stop existing, all you must do is stop believing in them. My name is Joseph Suglia, Suglia. Now, Nietzsche actually never writes this. That sentence is a thought that struck me as I was reading Essay 3 of Zur Genealogie der Moral, Eine Streitschrift on the Genealogy of Morals, a polemic by Friedrich Nietzsche, on which I will be lecturing today. So just to give an overview of this book, Essay 1 is schematic and quite simple. Essay 2 is extraordinarily complex. It's extraordinarily complex and gruesomely unpleasant. Essay 3, by contrast, is rather delightful and charming. So I read the third essay with undisguised delight. What is Essay 3 about? Well, Essay 3 concerns asceticism, which is the renunciation of all sensuousness. Sensuous here means whatever is worldly, whatever strikes the sensorium, whatever can be perceived, in particular, whatever delights the senses. So asceticism is the sacrifice, the surrender of all worldliness, all physicality, all corporality. So according to Nietzsche, morality is useless to the artist, right? Morality is useless to the artist, except perhaps as a subject of art. Art is not moral. Art is not moral. It exists in a sphere beyond good and evil. Artists are irresponsible, extra-moral, irrespective of whatever moral opinions the artist might have. This is why Nietzsche asserts the division between the artist as a human being and the artist as a maker of art. There is a division between the artist as a human being and the artist as a maker of art. So if Shakespeare were the Prince of Denmark, it would have been impossible for him to have created the Prince of Denmark, right? If Shakespeare were the Prince of Denmark, it would have been impossible for him to have created the Prince of Denmark. It is true that novelists, for example, have characters inside of them, to be sure. But let us not forget that characters are internal to the novelist and external to the novelist at the same time. A novelist is no more one's character than a mother is her son, right? The mother is not the son. The creator is not the creature, right? The artist is the manure, and the work of art is the flower that germinates, that blossoms from that manure. So this is one of the reasons why Nietzsche is ironically hopeful. Nietzsche is ironically hopeful that Richard Wagner's final opera, Parsifal, from 1882, is a joke. So Nietzsche is ironically hopeful that Parsifal, from 1882, is a joke, is a parody of Christian tragedy rather than the ponderous, portentous Christian tragedy that it appears to be. The subject of Wagner's Parsifal is the sacrifice of sensuality. If the work is a serious one, Nietzsche suggests, it is precisely the palateless, overblown, unintentionally ridiculous abomination that it appears to be. In other words, if Parsifal is a work that is born from asceticism, then it is bad art. Then it is bad art. For art and asceticism are incommensurable, right? Art and asceticism are incommensurable. That is to say, they are incompatible. So the artistic genius is not what Nietzsche's unofficial mentor, Schopenhauer, thinks that an artist is. No, no, no. Schopenhauer believes that the artistic genius is a hypertemporal and hyperspatial genius, an entity that is constrained neither by space nor by time. This is Schopenhauer. It is as if the artist were somehow outside of the world when one creates art. Now, that's not Nietzsche. Again, that is Schopenhauer, Nietzsche's unofficial mentor, right? Schopenhauer calls the artist the pure subject of knowledge. He does this in The World as Will and Representation, by which he means that the artistic genius is free from all individuality, free from all particularity. This, of course, is nonsense. It's fatuous folderol. It's bosh, of course. Does this mean, or would this mean, that the artist is not subject to the will to life, right? The will to life, as you might know, is the will to reproduce life. So is the artist not subject to that drive, to that impulse? Does the artist not want one's works to perdure? Does the artist not want one's works to perdure through time? Even if the artist is celibate, the artist does want one's works to survive beyond the artist. Isn't that the case? So art for Schopenhauer would be then an aesthetic. Do you get it? Art is not an aesthetic. Art is an anesthetic. Get it? A painkiller, right? An analgesic, right? And now Nietzsche identifies Schopenhauer's will to life with the libido. This will, of course, influence Freud, right? So these reflections are those of a 26-year-old man who wants to contemplate life purely without the intervention of his insistently bothersome libido, right? So the reflections of Schopenhauer are those of a 26-year-old man who wants to contemplate life purely without the intervention of his insistently bothersome libido. Schopenhauer wants to, quote, free himself from torture. That's Nietzsche's description. Von seiner Tortur loskommt. Essay 3, paragraph 6. That is, Schopenhauer wants to free himself from the torture of his libido, the demon that pursued Sophocles until old age. Now, I don't believe that the will in Schopenhauer is equatable to the libido. The will and the libido are not identical exactly, though the libido is a form that the will does take, to be sure. However, the point remains, Schopenhauer thinks that the artistic genius is unshackled by all sensuousness and by all sensuality, right? It's free. The artistic genius is free from sensuousness and from sensuality, according to Schopenhauer. So Schopenhauer is wrong, of course. He's obviously wrong, and Nietzsche points this out with glee, with malicious glee, with Schadenfreude. Artistic production is of the body and is traceable back to the cravings, to the impulses, to the drives, to the proclivities, to the inclinations, to the graspings and the gaspings, the pulsings and the palpitations of the body. Okay. But this attitude towards art, too, is asceticism, which is why Nietzsche is giving it to us as an example thereof. So Schopenhauer's theory of art is a form of asceticism, which is why Nietzsche is writing about that, and he's making fun of his unofficial former teacher. Likewise, Kant is wrong about art. Kant is wrong about art, which he only conceives from the perspective of the spectator, not the perspective of the artist. Kant does. Now, in the third critique, die Kritik der Urteilskraft, the critique of the power of judgment, Paragraph 2, Kant has this to write. Let me quote the German. Give me one moment. Give me one moment. So I have the German from Kant in front of me. Let me read that, please. Das Wohlgefallen, welches das Geschmacksurteil bestimmt, ist ohne alles Interesse. Translation into English: the pleasure which is determined by the judgments of taste is without any interest. Pleasure which is determined by judgments of taste is without any interest. Okay. Now, Kant considers aesthetic judgment to be without interest, right? That is, it suppresses the hungers of the body. Aesthetic judgment would be, for Kant, the suspension of the human appetites, right? So for Kant, aesthetic judgment, the judgment of art, would be the suspension of the appetites of the body, the hungers of the body, the cravings of the body. This is nonsense. This is absolute nonsense. I mean, how could one judge something, anything, without being interested in it? And what are we supposed to flick a switch on our bodies, in our bodies, and not have bodily feelings when we judge a work of art? This is one of the reasons why I'm much more sympathetic towards Nietzsche than I am towards Kant. I have read Kant. I've read a great deal of Kant, but I've always preferred Nietzsche to Kant. Anyway, how could you judge something, anything, without being interested in it? That's what Kant believes. That's what you have to believe if you are a Kantian, right? Anyway, is this uninterestedness the case for judgments of all representations of human beauty? So whenever you judge a work of art, do you do so as if you were a brain floating in the ether? You were as if your mind were disincarnated, as if your brain were disembodied and had no connection with the rest of the body. Is that what we're supposed to believe? Are people supposed to look at paintings and sculptures and film, although Nietzsche really didn't live long enough to see the full flourishing of the cinema? I know there were films that were made while Nietzsche was alive in his later years, but are people supposed to watch films and feel nothing physical at all? Are people supposed to look at paintings and feel nothing at all? Are people supposed to look at sculptures and feel nothing at all? Well, if Botticelli's Venus or Michelangelo's David stir up sensual feelings in the spectator, does this mean that they are not works of art? If Kant were correct. So if you're looking, I don't want to say you, but if a spectator, if the recipient is looking at a work of art and feels nothing at all, then that is the appropriate aesthetic response. That is the appropriate response to a work of art, according to Kant. So I guess I'm wondering, if a spectator looks at a work of art, let's say Botticelli's Venus or Michelangelo's David, and actually does feel the sensual appetites being activated, right? Does that mean that that work of art ceases to be a work of art? Does that mean that what one is looking at is not a work of art? Is that what that means? Anyway, so if one looks at a beautiful vista in the work of Caspar David Friedrich, for example, a beautiful mountainscape, and a feeling of exhilaration is stirred up within the spectator, is that work then not beautiful? Is that work then not art? All right. By contrast, aesthetic judgment for Nietzsche is somatic, physiological, by no means free from interestedness. If you judge a work of art, you are interested in that work of art. Indeed, the concept of disinterested judgment is paralogical, right? Paralogical, meaning it's a fallacy, it's a mistake, it's an error. There is no such thing as a disinterested judgment, And even the very concept of that is self-contradictory. So I guess I would say that Nietzschean aesthetics is a kind of somatics, right? Kind of somatics. Nietzsche has a kind of physiology of art, right? Which he never really elaborated expansively, but Nietzsche does believe in the physiology of aesthetics, right? Anyway, philosophy is riddled with ascetic ideals, with moralistic prejudices. Anyone who has read Nietzsche's great book, Beyond Good and Evil, Prelude to a Philosophy of the Future, knows this. And if you're interested, I have created a 20-hour video series in which I read my English translation of Beyond Good and Evil for you. I should give the full title, Beyond Good and Evil, Prelude to a Philosophy of the Future. And I also comment on the text from time to time, so if you're interested. But anyway, so we know that Nietzsche exposed the fact that philosophy is riddled with ascetic ideals, with moralistic prejudices. The most basic ascetic ideal is hate the world, hate life, sacrifice the flesh. That's moralism. That is asceticism. So asceticism is the renunciative position towards life, right? Asceticism is the sacrifice of life for the sake of life. I'll get to that in a moment, but I don't want to get ahead of myself. Asceticism is the repudiation of all sensuousness and of all sensuality. Now, Nietzsche does psychologize here, and one might take exception to that, but he does. He psychologizes. Why is it, he wonders, that philosophers such as Kant, Leibniz, and Schopenhauer never got married? But then again, Nietzsche never got married either. Nietzsche never wonders in writing why he never got married. Anyway, why is it that classical philosophy is generally so antagonistic towards the body? Why is that? Now, I want to highlight Nietzsche's overall argument by citing the following sentence. Okay, let me cite it in English, and then I will quote the German. Every animal, including la bête philosophe, that means the philosophical beast, the philosophical animal. So every animal, including the philosophical animal, instinctively strives towards an optimum of favorable conditions under which it can completely release its force and attain its maximal feeling of power. Now, give me a moment. I will read that in the German as well. So let me read the German. Jedes Tier, somit auch la bête philosophe, strebt instinktiv nach einem Optimum von günstigen Bedingungen, unter denen es seine Kraft ganz herauslassen kann und sein Maximum im Machtgefühl erreicht. Essay 3, paragraph 7. So one of the ways in which the human animal attains its maximal feeling of power is through self-sacrifice, which is something I wrote my dissertation on. Giving up is giving over to. I want to say that again, because that formula, and I know it's a formula, I know it sounds like a slogan, but I think it's helpful as a propedeutic for understanding. Listen, giving up is giving over to. Renunciation is access. Yes, the ascetics give up life, but they do so in order to affirm their own will to power, which is life itself. Let me say that again. Yes, the ascetics give up life, but they do so in order to affirm their own will to power, which is life itself. The ascetic gives up life in order to intensify, to enhance, to augment one's own feeling of life. So asceticism is not a repudiation of life. Asceticism is not a repudiation of life. Life is not canceled out by asceticism. No. Yes, most classical philosophers surrender the physical world and the body in particular, but that is in order to discharge their own philosophical will to power. So yes, it's true that classical philosophers give up the body, give up the world, but they do so in order to discharge their own philosophical bodily will to power. You see what happens here? It's a paradox. So the ascetic philosopher gives up marriage, right? I'm not going to get married, says the philosopher, in order to optimize one's philosophy. Get it? The philosopher secludes oneself, and very often it's a himself, but not always. But let's be honest, in the history of philosophy, there were too many men and not enough women. And I think that's because women were excluded from philosophy, which is a shame. So the philosopher excludes oneself from noise. Schopenhauer had a pathological hatred of noise, right? In order to create optimal conditions for his philosophizing. You see, Schopenhauer hated marriage and noise. He hated marriage, he hated noise. Not because he thought that celibacy and quietude are virtues. No, no, no. But because he considered marriage and noise to be hostile to his philosophy and to his philosophizing. And his drive to philosophize is superior to his drive towards companionship and sociability. You see how that works? So the renunciative process is not a virtuous one, not at all. The ascetics might give up sensuousness. It might be tautologous even to say that, right? It might be a tautology. It seems tautologous to say that the ascetics might give up sensuousness, right? But they are still exercising their will to power. In other words, they're still discharging life, and they're feeling for life. Literary artists and philosophers want to give birth not to literal children, but to books. Children are a form of non-literature, right? And there's a saying to translate this from the Latin. Human beings choose either offspring or books. Libere or libri, right? You choose. If you're a human being, and I assume all of you are, although there might be some modes of artificial intelligence in the audience, you choose to produce books or you choose to produce and reproduce human children, right? Anyway, literary artists and philosophers want to give birth not to literal children, but to books. Children are a form of non-literature. You see, writers and philosophers are pregnant with books. They're pregnant with books. They fear living an unmediated existence. Philosophers and writers fear living an unmediated existence. An existence in which they would live in order to die, right? That's what they're afraid of. Without producing a work of literature or philosophy that might survive them. And this desire for survival, long after their death, is an instantiation of the will to power, which again is life itself. So again, asceticism optimizes philosophical reflection. There is an exchange of interest here, right? You give up one thing in order to get something else in return. The argument in Essay 3 really begins with the analysis of the mind of the ascetic priest. This is a characterology. It's a kind of psychology, right? Nietzsche is at his best when he gives us characterologies, right? I mean character studies. Now here, I want to underline the point that life must have a reason for allowing the ascetic priest to exist. Why are there so many ascetic priests on the planet Earth? Why? Why are there so many ascetic priests on the planet Earth? Despite the fact that they are so anti-life, this is a real question. This is a real question, to the point that if an alien species were to come to the planet Earth, the extraterrestrials would think that the planet Earth is the planet of ascetic priests, not the planet of the apes, but the planet of the ascetic priests, right? So teeming is the planet with ascetic priests who are a swarm everywhere, right? Ascetic priests are swarming the earth. Here I want to highlight Nietzsche's central argument. Yes, the ascetic priests desensualize themselves and try to impose their will on everyone else. They are ragingly antagonistic towards sensuousness. Why? I'll tell you in a moment. So it is true that the ascetic priests are ragingly antagonistic towards sensuousness. Yes. However, even as the ascetic priest is giving up the pleasures of the flesh and demanding that everyone else do the same, he is still exercising his fleshly impulses. And the ascetic priest belongs to the economy of life. So even he contributes, I should pronounce it, even he contributes to the economy of the human species and conserves the human species as he serves as a kind of toxic agent to the human species. In the same way that some poisons are curative and serve to drive out other poisons, right? So the ascetic priest is anti-life, yes, but he's also in a strange way pro-life. The ascetic priest is nauseated by life. He is sick from life and he is sick of life. And like any person of resentment, wants everyone around him to be as unhappy as he is. He looks discontentedly at those who are happy, at those who enjoy living. He wants to exact revenge on the happy, basically. As Huysmans writes, to paraphrase, those who are miserable do atrocious things, right? This is Huysmans. Those who are miserable do atrocious things so that everyone else will be as miserable as they are. And H.L. Mencken writes somewhere, I forget exactly where, but H.L. Mencken writes that Puritanism is the idea that someone somewhere is happy. And the point is to make what Mencken means is that Puritanism is the attempt to make those few happy people on the planet Earth unhappy. Anyway, so who is the ascetic priest? The ascetic priest is a doctor, but a sick doctor and a doctor of sickness, right? So the ascetic priest is a doctor who wants to sicken everyone around him. The doctor wants to sicken everyone with whom he comes into contact, and even those with whom he does not come into contact. The ascetic priest is a bit like Malvolio, if you've ever read Twelfth Night or What You Will by Shakespeare. If you know the play, you will remember that Malvolio is anti-fun. He is a person of resentment, right? He says to the happy characters in the play, Act 5, Scene 1, I'll be revenged on the whole pack of you. The ascetic priest is like that. The ascetic priest is like a doctor who is sick himself and who wants to sicken everyone around him, especially the vigorous, the life-affirming, the strong, the creative. Now, I want to cite the text. Give me a moment. I'm going to cite the text. Okay, so let me say this again and then I'll cite the text. So the ascetic priest is like a doctor who is sick himself and who wants to sicken everyone around him, especially the vigorous, the life-affirming, the strong, and the creative. Now I'm going to cite the text in English and then in German. The ascetic priest must be accepted by us as the predestined savior, herdsman, and champion of the sick herd. Thereby do we first understand his awful historic mission. The lordship over sufferers is his kingdom. To that points his instinct, in that he finds his own special art, his master skill, his kind of happiness. He must himself be sick. He must be kith and kin to the sick and the abortions, so as to understand them, so as to arrive at an understanding with them. But he must also be strong, even more master of himself than of the others. Impregnable, forsooth, in his will for power, so as to acquire the trust and the awe of the weak, so that he can be their hold, bulwark, prop, compulsion, overseer, tyrant, God. He has to protect them, protect his herds. Against whom? Against the healthy. Doubtless also against the envy towards the healthy. He must be the natural adversary and scorner of every rough, stormy, rainless, hard, violently predatory health and power. Now that's quite a bit to read. All right, let me read this. Der asketische Priester muss uns als der vorherbestimmte Heiland, Herd und Anwalt der kranken Herde gelten, damit erst verstehen wir seine ungeheure historische Mission. Die Herrschaft über Leidende ist sein Reich. Auf sie weist ihn sein Instinkt an. In ihn hat seine eigenste Kunst, seine Meisterschaft, seine Art von Glück. Er muss selber krank sein. Er muss selber krank sein. Er muss den Kranken und schlecht Weggekommenen von Grund aus verwandt sein, um sie zu verstehen, um sich mit ihnen zu verstehen. Aber er muss auch stark sein, mehr Herr noch über sich als über andere, unversehrt namentlich in seinem Willen zur Macht, damit er das Vertrauen und die Furcht der Kranken hat, damit er ihnen Halt, Widerstand, Stütze, Zwang, Zuchtmeister, Tyrann, Gott sein kann. Er hat sie zu verteidigen, seine Herde. Gegen wen? Gegen wen? Gegen die Gesunden. Es ist kein Zweifel. Auch gegen den Neid auf die Gesunden. Er muss der natürliche Widersacher und Verächter aller rohen, stürmischen, zügellosen, harten, gewalttätig, raubtierhaften Gesundheit und Mächtigkeit sein. Essay 3, paragraph 15. Essay 3, paragraph 15. Okay. How does the ascetic priest act as if he were a doctor? Well, he sets as his mission the anesthetization of pain. Let me say that again. How does the ascetic priest act as if he were a doctor? Well, he sets as his mission the anesthetization of pain. How does the ascetic priest anesthetize pain? He anesthetizes pain by excessive emotion. He anesthetizes pain by excessive emotion, by stirring up excessive emotion in his, in quotes, patients. In so doing, in numbing the pain of his, in quotes, patients, he enlarges their wounds. He widens their wounds. So self-dissatisfaction is common. Most people are dissatisfied with themselves. What the ascetic priest does is this. What the ascetic priest does is this. He enlarges the wounds of his patients and parlays their wounds to his own advantage. He magnifies their feelings of self-discontentment and thus minifies their feelings of self-worth. So what is the analgesic for the pain of his patients? What is the anesthesia for the pain of his patients? The ascetic priest narcoticizes his patients by changing the direction of their pain. The patient would naturally say, I hate the person who hurt me, right? I hate the person. I hate him. I hate her. But what does the ascetic priest do? The ascetic priest has a different opinion. And the ascetic priest has a different course of treatment, a different method of treatment. The person, this is what the ascetic priest says in so many words. The person who hurt you is not responsible for your pain. Okay? You are responsible for your own pain. That is what the ascetic priest says in so many words. You are responsible for your own pain. In other words, the ascetic priest narcoticizes the pain of his flock by inflicting them with the feeling of guilt. This is the watchword of the ascetic priest. Torment yourself with paroxysms of guilt. The more intense, the fierier, the more fervid the feeling of your own guilt, the less pain you will feel. So the patients, so-called, of the ascetic priest are enraptured with paroxysms of guilt and the feeling of their own lowliness, which is in itself a manifestation of the will to power. For self-denigration, in a paradoxical manner, is the exercise of control over oneself, right? Lowering yourself is a form of controlling yourself. The result, of course, is that the human animal feels worthless, and this leads to the self-minimization of the whole of humanity, whole with a W, right? Human beings begin to feel worthless, and this leads to the making worthless of all of humanity. Now, the mass feeling of guilt has calamitous effects upon the human species. To summarize, let me summarize the entire essay through. Asceticism is a turning against life, but it is still a propulsion of life. We mustn't deceive ourselves into believing falsely that asceticism has nothing to do with life. No, no, no. Asceticism has everything to do with life, because negation is affirmation. Devitalization is revitalization. Those who seek to devitalize life unwittingly affirm life. So now let us discuss the amazing opening and closing of the third essay. The human being would rather will nothingness than not will at all. The human being would rather will nothingness than not will at all. Lieber will noch der Mensch das nichts wollen, als nicht wollen. Essay 3, paragraph 28. Now, this statement is written, again, at the beginning of Essay 3. So that statement is written at the beginning of Essay 3 and at the end of Essay 3. Now, I believe that this statement is indebted to a novel by Goethe, to Goethe's last novel, and in my opinion, his best novel, which he told a female railway passenger was his best book after she claimed that she disliked it. Goethe said, "Damn it, that's my best book," to this female passenger. Schade, das ist mein bestes Buch, Goethe said. Anyway, and that book is Elective Affinities, as it's sometimes translated. Sometimes it's translated as Kindred by Choice. But anyway, in German it is Die Wahlverwandtschaft from 1809. Now, Goethe fashioned 3 novels, only 3, but they certainly are imperishable books. He didn't need to write novels. Die Leiden des jungen Werthers, The Sorrows of Young Werther. Wille Meister, which is a book in 2 parts, and Die Wahlverwandtschaft, right? So a character named Charlotte in Elective Affinities, as it's often translated into English, a character named Charlotte says to her husband Edward at the end of the first chapter, Und doch ist es in manchen Fällen notwendig und freundlich, lieber nichts zu schreiben als nicht zu schreiben. So my English translation would be, and indeed it is in many cases necessary and friendly to write nothing instead of writing nothing at all. Or let me phrase it a different way. And indeed it is in many cases necessary and friendly to write nothing instead of not writing at all. So I believe that Nietzsche was thinking consciously or unconsciously of Goethe, because this, I believe, is the precursor, the literary precursor of Nietzsche's statement. So what does Nietzsche's statement mean? The human being would rather will nothingness than not will at all. So when Nietzsche writes the will, he means the will to power. The will to power has a horror vacui, right, which means the horror of the vacuum. Nature abhors a vacuum, as every school child knows. Nature abhors the vacuum. Meaninglessness is intolerable to the human animal, which is determined by its will, because the human animal cannot tolerate the idea of a senseless existence. A shabby logos is better than no logos at all, right? So as far as we know, the human animal, the human beast, the imbestial animal, right, is the only animal that requires meaning and which prefers meaning to non-meaning. I invented the word imbestial to refer to the human animal. The human animal is the imbestial beast, right? Because it is the only animal that requires meaning. It is the only animal which prefers meaning to non-meaning. So the will confers significance. The will introjects meaning into every vacuity. The will introjects meaning into every nothingness. Get it? We interpret not when there is something that is explained for us, but when there is nothing that is explained. Let me say that again, because I think this is an important point. We interpret not when there is something that is explained for us, but when there is nothing with which is explained. We interpret not when there is something that is explained for us, something that is pre-given, but when there is nothing which is explained. So, even the ascetic pessimistic will is an instantiation of the will to power. Even the ascetic pessimistic will is an instantiation of the will to power. The pessimistic will is the world negating will. It is the will that hates the world and that desires the annihilation of the world. The pessimistic will, even the nihilistic will, is a manifestation of the will to power. The will to power is the living itself, which means that all of life is bound up with relativities of power. Each living organism has the irreversible desire to become tyrant of the whole of existence. Even the will to demolish oneself To annihilate oneself in the face of the imaginary divine is an instantiation of the will to power. Because the self is assuming that it has the power to negate itself. You see? So even someone who says, I'm worthless, I'm nothing, I feel as though I'm nothing, even that is a manifestation of the will to power. Someone who genuinely feels as if he or she were a non-entity, someone who just feels as if one is nothing, when we're nothing. That itself is an instantiation of the will to power, which is the living itself, which is life itself. Because the self assumes that it has the power to negate itself. By pretending to negate itself, it gives itself the feeling of the enhancement of its own power. The will to power is irreducible. It is fundamental. So thank you very much. My name again is Joseph Suglia. That's not me, but this is the book I'm lecturing on. Zur Genealogie der Moral, Eine Streitschrift on the Genealogy of Morals, a polemic by Friedrich Wilhelm Nietzsche. And this was the third and final video in the video series in which I lecture on the book. Thank you very much. If you haven't yet done so, please go back and listen to the first two videos in the series. I hope this was instructive to you, and I encourage you to watch and listen to my other videos on Nietzsche and on other sundry topics. This is Joseph Suglia, Suglia, signing out and signing off. Thank you very much.